Hi everyone, I got some good questions to answer this time. Again, some very good questions in terms of clarification questions, which I'll get to. I just want to, I suppose, ceremoniously at this point in this. I think this is maybe the third or fourth or fifth time I've mentioned it, but I am remember, right, the focus of this course is writing the paper, absolutely writing the paper. Now, everything else should help you and should guide you in that. These videos, for example, these wrap up where I deal with the clarification questions, should give you a little bit more clarity on some of the main concepts that we've looked at in the reading, that we've discussed, or well, that we've read in the reading, that you've read in the reading, and that we're going to incorporate some of these concepts into our papers correctly and that sort of thing. And so this is the clarification questions. But again, everything we're doing is really pushing us towards that paper. A reminder that very, very soon at this point, two days away from when I'm making this video, we have that first deadline for the major project, right? We call it the course research progress check 1. May the 31st, you're going to hand in everything you've done up to now on that major research paper, and I'm going to give you some feedback on it next week when I read them to help you along with that. And so, yeah, don't forget that. That's important. If you hand it in, you get the points. If you don't hand it in, then you don't get the points. So whatever you hand in is you get full points for. I've said this on other videos as well, but I want to really make sure that it gets out there that, look, don't get 2.5. You get it for handing it in. Don't take that to mean that you have up to now perfect progress and everything's good. Rely on my comments and on my feedback for that, but not the score that you'll get for it, which will be, if you hand anything in again, full points. Okay. So that said, I want to move on now to I want to say one more thing about the research questions. I saw some marked improvement in lots of the research questions this week. As you know, as it's natural, right, you're getting the hang of what I'm asking you to do early on in any class, right? It takes a little bit to figure out what's the professor asking of me here, and so you know, with the feedback that I've given you. You know, thanks for implementing that. Those of you that have, I did notice that some of you have not implemented that feedback. There's a few people who are still quite, maybe you haven't fully understood the assignment, maybe you haven't read the syllabus or seen the rubric. I definitely advise you to make sure you're familiar with what's in the rubric for that, what's on the syllabus for that. Look at my feedback that I'm giving you each week, each module, and you know, let me know if there's anything that I can help to clarify for you, any sort of, you know, the purpose behind it, the rigor with which I'm scoring that is increasing as the semester goes on, right? Because I'm thinking I've given quite a lot of feedback on these at this point, right? Two or three times, and obviously and so I want, you know, if I want to get that. I want to get the message across, not because I think that I have a particularly, but because the reason I want to get the message across to you is that this really is the foundation for your big paper, which is worth 60%. You know, you can sort of hand in any old thing. The way I have it set up, yeah, you get half of the points for that research question if you just upvote something, right? So, you know, and even when you're not scoring very well, you know, you're getting a 6 out of 10 for the actual question, you know, that's still probably 80%, right? You're getting most of the points anyway. And I don't want you to be put off by that. I don't want you to be sort of lulled into a false sense of security for it, because if you're not getting this right, then the quality of that final paper is going to be less than it should be, right? Less than I hope it would be, which is going to result then in a low grade for the paper. So a lot of the repercussions are going to come at the end, right, when you turn your paper, not so much now with the research questions. So do get on board with that if you're not on board. As I said, I'm here to answer any questions, but I really do want you thinking about these readings in a way that's going to help you with that final paper. And that involves thinking quite carefully and clearly about what's actually written in the paper. You know, that's why I think lots of you are doing quotes. I like quotes. I think quotes are the way to go because you've got it there in front of you. You're looking at it. There's something specific that you're focused on. It's not sort of a general, not just a general, oh, he was talking about realism, right? Because, you know, certainly at the beginning of the course, right, realism maybe doesn't mean anything specific to you. But when you take the specific words that are in the reading and you have them in front of you, and then you start a bit of interpretation of that, right? You start to say, well, what does he mean by this, right? And you start to write a little bit about what that means to you. Now the question that you're asking is based in that reading. And as well, you've got in your mind, hey, I'm writing this other paper here, right? So I want to ask a question that I can answer, right? That I can answer in a section of my paper. And that's going to further the question that I'm answering in that paper, right? There's a few parts to it, but anyway. So I'm going to move on now. I feel like I've said that a few times, but there are still a few of you who are not quite there yet. And I don't want you going on saying, oh, well, I'm getting 80% for that anyway, so I'm getting a B and A plus. Because yes, there's not huge consequences for not being bang on in terms of a grade right now, but that's going to translate to a worse. I was going to say less good, right? A worse paper that's worth 60% of your grade. So bear that in mind. All right. That aside, let me answer some of these good questions. A couple of them, I think. The first two, at least, I've lost them though, in here somewhere. I have like 17 tabs open and like, where is that? It's not in there. Oh, I know why it's not there, because I came off it to check the date on that course research progress check. It's in 2 days. It's May the 31st. Let's have a look now then. Module 3, clarification question, step 1. So interestingly, like one of the good things, one of the reasons I use Beagle is that I can sort the questions by popularity and I can sort of see from top to bottom straight away. Interestingly, Samantha Mears, even though you have 3 upvoters, snuck into second place, and Wyatt Gavin, which is the question I'm going to start with, is right at the top there with 10, even though Christine Terrazas has 12 upvotes. So not sure what happened at the top. The rest of them look like they're in order, but just those top few got flipped around a little bit. All right, Kendall Bell on 8. Anyway, I'm going to start with Wyatt Gavin's question. It's a good question. It's at the top. It's got 10 upvotes. It's number 2, I think, even though it's in the first position for some reason. And somebody else wrote underneath, I'm glad to not be the only one wondering this. And so while I know, I guess I've got 10 upvotes, I've also got somebody voicing their support for this question. So there's really 2 questions that Wyatt has snuck in here. The first one is this: if America has no state above them that is to be held accountable, by Mearsheimer's definition, are we living in an anarchic state? So one of the things that realism does, so realism talks about anarchy, right? An anarchic state system is a tenet of realism, a strong, powerful tenet of realism, an anarchic state system, but not an anarchic state, right? So to say an anarchic state seems to mean something different, right? And in fact, I think to most realists, it will be a bit of a contradiction to have an anarchic state. So for realists and for international relations scholars more broadly, probably, right, they would put this line in between the state, inside the state and outside the state, right? So inside the state, the way, part of the definition of a state, right, is that it's not anarchic, right, that it has a government, that it has sovereignty, that government, it has a sovereign, which is the government usually, right, that rules that territory and those people that live in that territory, right? And that it has, the sovereignty, the idea of sovereignty is that there's a single voice, a single sovereign, ultimately that says, and that voice might not be really one man, right, or one woman, but it might be one body of people, right, like a legislature. In the case of the United States, right, you have that tripartite constitutional arrangement where you have a court, a legislature and an executive that's all ultimately somehow sovereign, although the people are sovereign and they just choose. So the sovereign can be quite a complex sovereign, like the sovereign in the United States, but ultimately there's a government, right? There is a government, and so because there's a government, then it's automatically not anarchic, right? So since every state has some sort of sovereign government, no state is anarchic itself. What realists do say, though, is that, and what Mearsheimer I think will agree on, I think as you're pointing out there, is that the state system, the international system, is anarchic. That there isn't, as you said there, a state above the United States. There isn't one governing. There isn't one government, right? One sovereign, right, that stands above states, that tells states what to do, and punishes them when they do wrong things. There are some people would point to like the UN, maybe, right, or to international courts that are attached to the UN, that are incorporated into the UN, as maybe an attempt at this sort of sovereign above states. Others would say, look, what's the United Nations, right? It's a group of states, right? So there's nobody really above the states. It's just an intergovernmental organization where the states themselves have decided, sort of pooled their sovereignty, right? There's no sovereign above the states, right? There's no source of sovereignty above states, right? That's sort of two ways of looking at the United Nations. Anyway, so for realists, though, the international system is anarchic, right? Which only means, right? It only means that there's no international government. There's no government of states. In the United States, if individuals or groups, corporations, businesses or churches or individual states or individual cities or counties or something like that, if they make some decision, that decision could be questioned, right? And we could call that into question, and we could ask the ultimately probably the Supreme Court, right, in the United States, is this legal? Have they outstepped their bounds? And then the government, right, in the form of the Supreme Court, or perhaps in the form of the executive or the legislative, could make a new law. Legislature could make a new law to prevent that city doing the thing that it wants to do, or to prevent that state, or prevent that church, or to prevent that business, or to prevent me and you doing something that we otherwise would do. And if we then break that, they can come and punish us, right? And so within the United States, within all states, is the idea is that it's not anarchic. And if it is anarchic, then you say, well, there's not a state. So if we say, like a country like Somalia, sometimes we talk about Somalia as a failed state, and so you say, well, it's anarchic. There's no strong government. Libya, right? There's 5 governments in Libya, or at least that was the last time I counted. But then really you haven't got one state. You've either got many states, if in the case of Libya, or you've got maybe no state there, right? In the case of Somalia, if there's no government. But of course, and I don't want to get too deep into this because we're getting a little bit down into the weeds, but sort of philosophic weeds. But if there's no, usually if there's no government, there'll be a government, right? But you know what I mean? What I mean is, in the absence of one sovereign, other sovereigns will compete and try to become the sovereign, right? So there's not usually there's no space in the world that's not properly governed. Anyway, that's again a little bit further down into the weeds than we need to worry about, because we're talking about anarchy, right? And we're talking about states versus the state system. So the state system is just all the states in the world. They have some sort of a system, but that's the system is anarchic. For realists, it's every state for herself. You can only rely on yourself. There's nobody else to call. If a business or a church or something upsets me, wrongs me, takes away my rights, I can call the government, either of the state or of the US, the United States government, and get some sort of redress for that. If Bulgaria upsets Serbia, there's nowhere to go, right? Again, we could talk about the UN in that situation, but for realists, don't put a lot of store in the UN. Or if they do put some store in the UN, it's that, well, Of course, the UN only has the power of the states that are in it, so it's just other states that are intervening, right? So it's every state for itself. You know, maybe they would get Russia to intervene or something like that on the side of the Bulgarians or the Serbs. But it's still every state does what it can do. And it goes back to that Malian dialogue that I was talking about in the last article. So that's the anarchic state system. The state system is anarchic for realism. States themselves are not anarchic. And so we wouldn't be living in an anarchic state. That's kind of a contradiction in terms on the basis that I just explained. But you're right, America has no state of both of them that can hold the United States accountable. And for realists, you know, technically, if you know, and there is some difference between realists on this, you know, is every state really a state, right? Some states will say, look, some realists, sorry, would say, look, you know, only the great powers really matter, right? States that can do what they want, right? Only some states really have an independent foreign policy. Luxembourg, you know, yeah, sure, it's sort of ceremonially a state or whatever, it's a nation state, it's an independent state, we recognize it, but you know, it can't have its own independent foreign policy, right? Independent of France and Germany that are around it, or even the United States or Russia. Russia's maybe, considering Germany and France are right there, Russia's probably not much of an influence, but certainly the United States is, France is, Germany's, Britain to some extent would be as well. And so they can't really act independently, right? So some realists will say, well, you know, that's not really what we mean by a nation state in the state system. What we really mean is great powers, right? We mean, you know, maybe certainly the United States, probably China, you know, maybe India, Russia, Germany, Britain, France, Japan, you know, and then of course it depends on who you are, right, as to how wide, you know, Turkey, Iran, North Korea, South Korea, important countries. So that's the first part of the question. The second part of the question, wow, I'm getting a lot out of this question. Thank you for it, Wyatt. Furthermore, what is the distinguishing factor between being the sole regional hegemon and being the global hegemon? So Mearsheimer, doesn't he say global hegemony is not possible, it's not obtainable. Regional hegemony for Mearsheimer is obtainable. Right? So that's one distinguishing factor, right? One's at least according to Mearsheimer, one's obtainable, one's not obtainable. Right? But that's a quick and easy one. But what does it mean? What's the difference? So I think you've got the idea of what a hegemon is, right? I like Greek. I spent a few years in Greece, and I still sort of study the region. But ietis is the Greek word for leader, and that's where hegemon, believe it or not, doesn't sound anything like it when you say it, but when you see it written down, you can kind of see the similarities at the beginning. Hegemon comes from the Greek word for leader, so that's sort of part of the context. And of course, we use it in international relations to sort of refer to a country that, a state, a nation state that perhaps has a great power, but it's one that sort of dominates those around it, leads those around it. And so we see, so coming from there, right, and joining it with what I just said, a global hegemon is a state that can lead the world, right? So now let's think of the United States, which is very clearly a candidate for being a global hegemon. Mearsheimer thinks it's not, but other authors have said that it is, right? Absolutely, there's some debate here. But if we say it's a global hegemon, what are we saying? Here's what we're saying. We're saying that its leadership and dominance is pretty much universally accepted in the world, that its foreign policy is the one that gets done, and I think this last part is really key. The last part of my definition is that it has to be able to project its military power, or I suppose its soft power. It has to be able to project its power across the whole world against all foes, so that if another state defies its wishes, it can punish it to the point where that state does not want to incur that punishment, where it's cheaper for that state to decide, okay, I'm going to go along with the US foreign policy because it's too expensive for me not to. But the United States will make it too expensive for me not to follow that policy. Right? And so certainly the United States is a candidate for that sort of status. But if we ask ourselves, I guess here's my test, right? Is the United States a hegemon? It's quite a daunting test, right? But does the United States always get its own way in every part of the world? And the answer has to be more and more no, right? Since the 1960s, probably more and more no. And maybe that's what Mearsheimer is thinking. Maybe that's why Mearsheimer has, maybe that's quite a high bar for a global hegemon. But, you know, can the United States have its own way in the Western Hemisphere? It seems to have had its own way. You know, some of the questions that we might ask is I've forgotten the name of the country, Venezuela. That's what I'm trying to think of, right? Venezuela seems to be resisting US foreign policy right now and over the last decade. And the question is, how effective has Venezuela been at resisting US foreign policy preferences, and how long can it resist those, right? And how the other thing to how committed is the United States to forcing it, right? What sort of resources is the United States prepared to use? And so let's go to that a little bit, the sort of the resources that they're prepared to use and the resources that they could use, the United States. Because we could say, well, they could be a global hegemon if they wanted to be, right? That's definitely an argument that you could make. You know, they have the resources and the power to be a global hegemon. It's just expensive for them, and they choose not to do that. Maybe it's not important. Any important foreign policy issue, they'll get their own way, right? And so we'll say Venezuela. We'll ask about Syria. We'll ask about Libya. We'll ask about Afghanistan. We'll ask about Ukraine, probably as well. We could go back to 2008 and start asking about Georgia. And that's really how you'll find out, and you'll decide, okay, if the United States gets its way in all of these areas, in Somalia as well, in Rwanda, going back a little bit further, in Yugoslavia, right, to what extent has the United States had its own way and is having its own way? North Korea, Iran. You know, and North Korea and Iran seem to be sort of effectively resisting the United States foreign policy preferences. Those are the top candidates for resistance. And so if they can resist, and if they don't feel the need to then maybe the United States is not a global hegemon. And so, you know, what's the scope of the hegemony of their leadership? Is it just in the Western Hemisphere, or is it just or is it in the whole world? Is it in large parts of the world but not the entire world? Is it just in North America? Right. It's certainly open to debate, but Mearsheimer thinks that there's no global hegemon. It's too difficult to project your power across that distance. If anybody can, the United States can. So I wouldn't say there's any other candidate for global hegemony right now. The power projection, and this is something that you would talk about in international relations. The United States Navy is a very effective instrument of military power that can be projected. You know, the large number of aircraft carriers that can turn up pretty much anywhere in the world, and that are already are anywhere in the world. All the fleets. What is it? They taught me when I was at an undergraduate at Brunel. David Scott. He taught me something like this. You know, there's more aircraft carriers in the U.S. 7th Fleet than there are in the British Navy and the Royal Navy, right? And the Royal Navy is not a small, insignificant power, right? But you know, the United States has a Royal Navy in every sea. And so that's enables it to project its power very effectively, you know, through airstrikes and the threat of force. And of course, we could talk about soft power as well, which we might want to do. The influence that the United States has culturally in the world is, you know, how effective is that at to help the United States get its own way? And certainly nobody else, you know, China, which is a big power in the region, right, in East Asia, it's a great power, and even further afield, right, into parts of Europe, certainly, and more into Europe, and certainly into Africa recently, and Latin America. Can China have its way in North America, right? You would say no, I think. Can it have it in Western Europe? You know, there are some some sort of efforts in that direction, right? To work with West European countries and various projects, but it's not backed up by the military capability to project its power. Its navy is nothing like the United States' navy, right? Nowhere near as powerful. It doesn't. It has one aircraft carrier that I think it took from Ukraine and refurbished. I think maybe, did I read recently it built its own aircraft carrier? So it's got a, that puts it, I think, on par with the Royal Navy in Britain. So, but not sufficient to project military power like the United States. So yeah, again, I'll finish this off by just reminding us that Mearsheimer's point is that there can't be a global hegemon. So the sole regional. See, I haven't really addressed a major part of your question yet, Wyatt. I've addressed tons of your question, but not. It's quite a major. So we've got different regional hegemonies. Well, what's the difference between being a sole regional hegemon? And I think that's still the difference. I think we've still discussed that difference. It's just saying, okay, if like with Mearsheimer, right? You're saying, look, the United States, it's a regional hegemon. But here's the difference, right? The United States is the only hegemon, the only regional hegemon. It wants us to prevent, according to Mearsheimer, prevent China becoming a rival regional hegemon in East Asia, like it did the Soviet Union, like it did Germany, according to Mearsheimer again. But I think that's the difference. The difference is, if you're a sole regional hegemon, your foreign policy preferences, they hold sway in your region. Nobody else in your region can really challenge your foreign policy. But other states in other regions can challenge your foreign policy. They can do things that you don't want to do. The Chinese can do things that they don't want you to do in building those islands in the South China Sea. The Iranians can do it by pursuing like nuclear power. The Russians can do it by interfering in Ukraine and Georgia and threatening the Baltic states and all that. So when other countries can defy you, then you're not a regional hegemon. Can defy you with impunity, with little to no cost, then you're not a global hegemon. Being a regional hegemon and stopping other people being regional hegemons means that you have influence over your own backyard, but nobody else has that same. And so here it comes. I think it's sort of the divide. What's the Latin? Divide et imperio, or something like that, right? That divide and rule is all it is. It's just Latin for divide and rule. But if you can keep East Asia from coalescing, from being bullied into, or from being overpowered by China into one giant region where China's governing all of the resources in that region, governing foreign policy, internal policies in that region. Now the United States, which governs the whole Western Hemisphere, doesn't have to face a formidable opponent. It always has friends like Japan, South Korea, who can keep China in check, and sort of, South Korea and Japan will follow US foreign policy. So you've got somebody in that region that's doing it. You're denying China those resources. Same with maybe Germany, right? In Europe, Germany or Britain or France in Europe, or the EU even, right? As long as you prevent a coalescence of forces in one region. If you can prevent that, then you can, it's easier for you to govern. But still, I guess they're not threatening to you then. I suppose it's the difference between, well, I was going to say it's the difference between China and the United States. It almost is, but then Mearsheimer would say no. Well, I hope that clears it up a little bit. Sole regional hegemon. China's not right now a sole regional hegemon. It wants to be. It could be. It almost is one, but the United States is stopping it, and it has Japan and South Korea to prevent that. It can't make China do what it wants to do, but it can prevent it from becoming more of a. If China was a regional hegemon, it would be more of a threat to the United States than it is right now, because it would obtain those resources, and that it wouldn't have to worry about Japan anymore or South Korea anymore. It wouldn't have to worry about India anymore, perhaps. And so then it could just focus all of its attention on the United States. Yeah. Wow. That, I wasn't as satisfied by my answer in the end as I thought I was going to be, but I was nevertheless fairly satisfied. B plus for me. Great question. I'm going to do one last one, I think. Well, I'm going to, because Samantha Mears has slipped in there even with 3 upvotes, I suppose there's, maybe it's there because there's like somebody's put a response to it who says, I also asked if China was considered a superpower today, not only due to their size of government and their strong economy, but to do with its control and influence over mass media, such as owning TikTok. I did not know that. And Zoom. I also did not know that. I also considered Russia to be a superpower, right? Very fair enough. Due to its government and influence, Russia too is having influence over elections in other countries due to technology. Could technology play into having 3 superpowers? Great. All right, that's the response to Samantha Mears' question from somebody, which was, are China and the United States perceived as so powerful due to the size of the land that they govern? I do want to answer this one. Let me show you something, actually. This is long. All right. I'm going to show you something. Well, I'm just going to bring it up. It's called the Correlates of War data set. And so what it is it's a data set, right? It's some data that the data they starts at 1816 and it goes to 2007, the most recent version, and it measures all sorts of things about conflict. One of the things that it measures, and one of the things that I want to sort of point us to, is the let me see if I can find this. What is this? Aha, yes it is. Oh, I actually have 2012 data for this. So 8 years ago, but it's the most recent data that they have. Let me see now. I'm going to share my screen with you. Share screen. There we go. All right. So the Correlates of War project, you can find it at correlatesofwar.org. They showed me this in graduate school and it's stuck in my mind. I think I used it one time in one of the papers I wrote. But have a look at this. Actually, this colored map doesn't really show us very much, but what it does show us is something called it's called sync. Now I have to remember all of those words, but basically it's the capabilities, right? The state material capabilities. I think maybe it's not. They do have that. Data sets, cards of war, country, state system membership, 2016, cause of war data, militarized interstate disputes, national material capabilities. This is what I'm wanting to point you to. National material capabilities, this is version 5, goes to 2012. Well, this is the data. I just want a picture for these purposes. But here's where you could find, if you like data, you like to play with data, here's a place to go. You can download the data. Oh, here's what I wanted to show you. So power is considered by many to be a central concept in explaining conflict. Realists, definitely. Right? And 6 indicators. So they have here 6 indicators of power. And it is military expenditure, military personnel, energy consumption, iron and steel production, urban population, and total population are included in this data set. So here's one way, and it is sync, right? Composite indicator of national capability. I would not have guessed that. It serves as the basis for the most widely used indicator of national capability, CINC. Composite indicator of national capability. And covers the period 1816 to 2012. So again, it's 6 indicators. They're measuring 6 things, and they're saying these 6 things together, if we add them, what they actually do is they take so military expenditure. They say, okay, how much is spent in the world? That equals 1, right? The whole entire world spends X on military expenditure. And they say, okay, of that expenditure, what percentage of that expenditure is spent by the United States, right? And then I don't know what they get to be honest with you, but let's say 50% or 60%. So then so for the US, right, it's a 0.6 score for that military expenditure. And they do that for all the other countries, and then they do that with military personnel, right? And the idea, this is a sort of military power, right? So you've got, yeah, you can count how many people, military personnel is just a count of how many people are in the military. You know, China obviously comes out very highly on that one because there's tons of people in the military. In China, North Korea, similarly, Turkey as well have a lot of people in the military. But while China have a lot of personnel, you know, their equipment, while it's perhaps catching up, it's not on a par with the United States equipment. So that's what military expenditure measures, right? The supposition is that if you're spending a ton of money on equipment, it's probably really good equipment, advanced technology that's expensive, right? And advanced materials to make it. And so they use these two together. Energy consumption, you know, if you're using the latest technologies, the latest, and if you're using a lot of them, then, you know, this is sort of industrial base, right? How much energy does your industrial base consume? Because if you have a large industrial base and you can sustain war for a longer period of time, and you can be effective at war, you can produce the stuff that you need to fight wars with. Iron and steel production is similar. You know, it's about can you produce the metals? Can your industrial base produce the metals that you need? And then population, you need urban, and they split urban population and total population because the idea is that urbanized people are, at least according to these folks, I didn't say it, they said it, are more skilled, more trained, more you know, wealthier, more useful generally, apparently, than people living in the countryside. So, all right. So that's at least the suppositions that they use, and so they add all that up and they get a score, and it's a percentage score. Like what percentage of material capabilities does the United States command? Does China command? Does any other country? And then they come up with this map. I'll show you a graph in a minute, I think. But this is a chart here. It's very informative, right? Highest to lowest, and so you can see who are the powers, right? And so then this is a sort of statistical way, right? One idea, a widely used idea that tries to answer the question that you're asking about who are the great powers, and you've got a lot of them here, right? You've got certainly the United States here. You've got Mexico there. You've got Britain, thankfully. You've got France, Germany, Italy. France, Germany, Italy. Yeah, that's right. Turkey, I've mentioned a couple times. Iran, Pakistan, India, China. Let's say Russia, Indonesia. Did you say Japan already? Looks like Korea. The Koreas are in there too. I did not mean to click on that. Here we've got Saudi Arabia there too, as well as Iran. And then you see like next, the next, did I say Brazil? Got Brazil too. Then the next rank, right, you've got sort of Australia, Egypt is there, Iraq, Syria, Ukraine, Poland, Spain, South Africa, Argentina. All right. But anyway, you can see that, and you can certainly go on the internet and find that and have a look at that. And again, download the data set and have a look. One of the things, something that I made it and then I found it on Wikipedia after I'd made it. Let's see, national capabilities, correlates of wars, Wikipedia. Let's do that, and then let's click on images. Image of cows. Thank you. I did put cow, I suppose, but this is what I was looking for. I made this and then I found it. It's Wikipedia. I'm gonna try and make this big for you. Yeah. So this is that measure, which remember goes up to 2012, and it's this measure from 1812 or something. So 200 years of this here is the percentage, right? The percentage of the total capabilities in the world that each country have, and so it's a little bit heartbreaking, right? If you're British or if you love the British, oh, I made it go small. But look, this is Britain here. Starts off in 1800, you know, the early 1800s. You're looking at about a third of the total iron production, energy consumption, military expenditure, military personnel, urban population, all that together. We had about a third of it. The British had about a third of it, and that continued on until the second half of the 19th century, and then it just plummets down to where we're in the 2000s and we're under 0.05% of the total capability. So bear in mind, over this time, total capability in the world has grown, right? The pie has grown, and so our different states have become relatively stronger or relatively weaker. Britain, which was by far the strongest state before in the 19th century, above there, Russia and the United States. It is now, well, there's only 4 countries in here. We might have seen France up there somewhere maybe, but certainly Britain was the biggest. And then we see Britain coming down. We see, of course, the rise of the United States. And if you see these 2 peaks here, this is the First and Second World War, where the United States ramps up its power, ramps up its production of war material, conscripts a bunch of people into the military. Of course, you can kind of see it here in Britain as well, but it's to a much lower extent. The United States, you can see very clearly, right? And then it comes down again as they demilitarize, as they the First World War ends, and then the Second World War, boom, you see the ramp up again, and then again the de-escalation comes down. Another interesting one to look at is Russia, which includes the Soviet Union before 1990. So you see the Soviet Union at this point here. What's that? The 70s. They're ahead of the United States at this point. But then this big drop here is the breakup of the Soviet Union. And so Russia kind of goes down there just above Britain. The other interesting one, which is why these 4 are all on there, is China, which from when we start our records in 1850s, it's up there. It's second to the British here. The Russians take over. That's the Americans. I apologize. The Americans take over. The Russians take over here, but following the 1990s, following the end of the Soviet Union, the United States remains flat, and China is booming in terms of national capabilities. So that's one way to measure this sort of great power argument. I'm going to stop sharing now and come over here, which was the 3rd question. Oh, this is the wrong one. Are China and the United States perceived as so powerful due to the size of the land that they govern? No, is one answer. Russia's landmass is bigger. Canada's landmass, I think, is bigger, right? It's certainly bigger than Britain's. But usually that's not a big measure. Usually the measure is population, which of course China and the United States both have very big populations, China in particular, also India. Big populations, military might, military expenditure, and also military personnel, and then industrial base. Can you supply your army independently of imports and that sort of thing? Is your domestic energy consumption very, very large, right? If it's very large, that means you have a big industry, and are you producing a lot of steel? It's iron at the beginning of that period, 1812. It's how much iron are you producing, but somewhere in the 60s or the 50s, they changed the steel production. How much steel are you producing? And because if you're producing steel using a lot of energy, you've got big, heavy industries that are necessary to supply your military. And then there's the military component, and then there's the population component, which you also need to support your military, right? You need to be able to conscript people, and you need to be able to have people working in factories, building the things that you need. So that's a popular way of deciding whether or not they're powerful. A country is powerful or not. So I hope that answered the question. Thank you for it, Samantha Mears. Although it was only getting 3 upvotes, it's a good question, and you did attract somebody to respond to it. One more then, if I dare. I dare. Let's see where I am. Modules. One more, because it was the winner really. This one should have been at the top without those responses. Let's see. It's taking some time. I suppose I could share the screen again while we're waiting. Oh, here it is again. Oh, what's happened? Oh, that's module 1. That's why. Tristan Morales got 14 upvotes in module 1. Module 3. Okay. It's coming. No, it's not coming. I'm going to share my screen. Whenever I say I'm going to share my screen, it just comes up. That's fine though. I'll share it so you can see the question that I'm looking at. Here's what I'm seeing. We've done Wyatt Gavin. Great question. We've done Samantha Mears. Also a very good question. Now we're going to do, since Christine won, we're going to do Christine Terrazas. Would China, Russia, and America be considered to be the superpowers of today? Oh no, we sort of already answered this. I've forgotten what it was. Does cyber warfare, security, and technology play into who is a superpower today, as the world is seeing what influence to do with the internet? Great question. And we can answer this. We can answer this very specifically now. Now that we've just looked at the correlates of war, we can see, okay, first of all, that first part, would China, Russia, and America be considered to be the superpowers of today? I think the answer, according to the correlates of war, is yes, along with other countries as well, like Iran, Turkey, I think we're in there, Britain, Brazil were in there, so other countries too. Let me quickly say though, like superpowers, the idea of superpowers comes from this, comes from the fact that there were great powers. Great powers of Europe, right? In the days when Europe was the most important participant in the international state system, you had, what did you have? Germany, France, Britain, Russia, Austro-Hungary. You know, maybe you count the Ottoman Empire before the First World War. But certainly the 19th century, the state system, it's centered in Europe. The great powers of Europe are those ones that I just mentioned. But certainly the six, right? Italy, I missed Italy, I apologize, it's Italy. But France, Italy, Russia, Germany, Britain. Who have I missed out now? There's usually six, aren't there? No, I don't know, maybe Spain. Maybe you put Spain in sometimes, and maybe you put Austro-Hungarian Empire in there as well, depending on the time, right? But the Austro-Hungarian Empire lasted for a long time. Anyway, so why did I start talking about 19th century Europe? Oh yeah, superpowers, right? So they were the powers, but what exceeded those powers, what acceded to, took over those powers was, after the Second World War, was the Soviet Union and the United States, which were much bigger, much more powerful than the smaller European powers, right? And so you didn't. So the idea of a superpower, right? The sort of coining of the word superpower was to differentiate these two new Soviet Union, new from the Russian Revolution after the Second World War. These two new powers that were not. They were of a different rank to Britain and Germany and Italy and France. They were above them, right? So they were, super just means above, right? Or over, right? So superpowers, they're above the powers, right? And so now, to say like superpowers of today, that's where we're at, right? So we're saying, are there any countries now that are just clearly over and above the other powers? So if we take the powers to be those dark ones on the Correlates of War website, then we say, okay, maybe China and the United States are over and above those. Is Russia over and above there? If we look at that statistic, if we look at this, hopefully you can see what I have to switch to, then UK is down, Russia, so you can make a value judgment there and say, China and the United States, according to this, Russia's a ways below. Russia has less than 0.05 of all of the power in the world. The United States, according to this, has 10 to 15%, 12%, let's say. China has 20%. So this is one measurement. So yeah. So that's one way to answer the question. I mean, there's other ways to answer the question, right? You can sort of do it by anecdote. What do we hear most from in the media? That sort of thing. But I wanted to spend most of my time, I think, answering the second part of the question. Does technology play into what a superpower is today? More influence due to the internet? Maybe. Certainly some people will argue that. I don't think so. I think ultimately it still comes down at the end. I'm not saying that, that everything has to be decided by war, but I think in the end, so having the biggest military and the strongest military, conventional military probably, and nuclear weapons, That's what does the main damage. We haven't seen like crippling damage done through the internet. Not that it's not possible, right? It is possible, and certainly worth studying, right? And there are people who do study this, right? Worth studying and seeing what sort of impact it could have, what the threat is. But as of now, it is just a threat, I would say, right? We've seen the devastation caused by war in World War II, in World War I. We've seen worldwide devastation, death, destruction. We know what that can do. We haven't quite seen this internet. What can it do? Yes, we've got some meddle. Oh, the Russians are meddling in our elections, or the fake news, that sort of thing. Yeah, that's really happening, and that's certainly worthy of study. But I can't put that on the same scale as dropping atom bombs on Japan, right? Or the Blitzkrieg through Europe in the Second World War. I can't put those things on the same scale yet. And not to say that it couldn't happen in the future, but that would be my argument into that, on that. And then, so I want to finish by just saying the correlate of war agrees with me, I suppose, right? Or I agree with it. It doesn't have none of its 6 factors really bring the internet in, right? They don't. You'd have maybe energy consumption, right? So how many servers you have would probably interfere with that. If you had a lot of servers, it would increase it, but that doesn't really get at what you're getting at, right? Because you don't need a ton of IT infrastructure to really affect people globally through the internet. And again, I think it's right. You can affect people globally through the internet relatively cheaply, but I don't know if it causes the devastation and destruction of nuclear weapons, or even of conventional forces, conventional weapons, airstrikes. What would I be most afraid of? What would I take more seriously? A threat from, well, that's a good question. Now that I ask it, because the other thing is deliverability. Like, let's say China somehow threatens to launch a conventional attack against the United States. I wouldn't see that as being credible, right? That'd be a very difficult operation for the Chinese military as it is today, with it not having much of a navy, and the United States being the most powerful navy in the world, and we're separated by water. Maybe if I was next door to China, though, maybe if I was Japan, right, that's also separated by water, but not as much water, or if I was South Korea or something, or North Korea for that matter, although they're already obviously incorporated into Chinese foreign policy. But if maybe if I was India, then that would be a credible threat that I would worry about. But I'm saying, from the point of view of the United States, I wouldn't really take seriously a threat from China of a conventional attack, but I would probably take seriously if there was some sort of a threat of internet warfare. But I would also be, as I said at the beginning, less concerned about the repercussions of an internet attack. Because of course I grew up in a time when there was no internet. What if they brought the whole internet down? Well, just go back to my teenage years. Go back to 1997. 1997 was great. But there's probably more threats than that, more than I'm giving it credit for there. To infrastructure, power infrastructure and that sort of thing. But of course we could do all those things offline before, and maybe that would be a way that we could take everything offline. The Russians managed recently to do that in an experiment where they isolated their internet from the global internet. I don't know how to use proper words for that. The Russian net, the network, I suppose, they basically blocked everything outside of Russia to see if they could do it. Right? So, and if they can do it, and if they did it, then I assume we can do it as well. We could take ourselves off if it became a major threat, which, as I said, I don't think it is up to this point. That was a really long video. I think it was full of great stuff. I hope that it was helpful to you. Maybe take it in chunks. How long did I go for? I don't think it tells me yet, but I'll see when I upload it to YouTube. Like I said, I do hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was interesting to you. A lot of information there, I think. There you go. Don't say, you know, don't say you don't get value for money there. All right. Stop sharing, and then I'm going to end this meeting.